Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of the origins of the Cold War. Our questions to think about are, how did the Cold War bring about another Red Scare? And how did the Red Scare contribute to a growing sense of conformity in the post-war years? In 1945, when the United States used atomic weapons against Japan to end World War II, we were the only nation with that technology. And there were some political analysts and diplomats who argued that it would be many more years before the Soviet Union had similar technology. But it turns out those Soviet spies are pretty good. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested successfully their own nuclear weapon. And this really ups the ante. This is really making the situation all the more dangerous. So in 1952, President Truman asks military leaders to develop a more powerful weapon. And this is where the hydrogen bomb comes in. When you take a look at these two satellite maps that shows the Eniwatal Atoll in the Pacific. So an atoll is a group of islands surrounded by a coral reef. So you see the islands are labeled, and then the shadowy area surrounding them, that's the coral reef. The picture on the left is before the so-called Mike test in 1952, where the hydrogen bomb was tested, and the satellite picture on the right shows after the detonation of this weapon. An entire island no longer exists because of this. And so within a year, the Soviets have a similar weapon. And it's just going to make all of this so much more stressful, because this is no longer just a diplomatic conflict. This is no longer just arguing or bickering or complaining. This is something that could be potentially deadly. And it's frightening, especially when you consider that over the next 40 years, the United States and the Soviet Union would manufacture over 100,000 nuclear weapons. Not surprisingly then, many Americans began to fear the possibility of a nuclear war. Terms like nuclear fallout became part of casual conversations, and many families began to prepare by constructing backyard bomb shelters. So in the picture, it says do-it-yourself shelter. You could pick up these plans from your local hardware store, or even maybe buy a kit. The picture at the bottom right shows a ready-made bomb shelter that you could install in your backyard. And of course, this is going to connect with your journal on the bomb shelter honeymoon. So because of this fear of communism being heightened by the possibility of a nuclear war, HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, is going to ramp up their efforts in looking for communist subversives within the United States government, people that might sabotage the American government. What's interesting is that HUAC had actually been in operation since 1938, but it's here after World War II that they really begin to expand their efforts. And so they're looking for anyone who might possibly be disloyal to the United States. And what makes this complicated is that during the 1930s, many people sort of turned to communism as a possible alternative to the capitalist system that they saw as broken during the Great Depression. So during the 1930s, the Communist Party of the United States of America, or CPUSA, was quite popular. But once we get through World War II, we see that enthusiasm for communism drop off dramatically. But now people are finding that earlier political attachment was coming back to haunt them, because HUAC is digging this up and suggesting that these people are disloyal to the United States. In addition, HUAC is going to be investigating Hollywood. because the concern was that any Hollywood director, screenwriter, producer, or maybe even actor could potentially put subliminal messages into Hollywood films that would encourage people to support the communist cause. When HUAC comes knocking on their doors in Hollywood, most people bent to the pressure. They gave in. If they had any information to share, they shared it, or they pointed fingers at other people. But one particular group of Hollywood directors, screenwriters, and producers refused to answer any of HUAC's questions. And so they were found guilty of contempt of Congress and sentenced to a year in jail. Once they got out of jail, they realized that Hollywood had shunned them, that they had caved into HUAC's pressure, that they had been blacklisted. No Hollywood studio would hire them. And so this contributes to this fear of speaking out, or a fear of, do you really know the people that you're working with? But usually when we talk about the Red Scare of the 1940s, the name that you cannot avoid is Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin, and he was really looking to make a name for himself. In 1950, he grabbed headlines when he made a speech at a Republican women's meeting in West Virginia, of all places, where he held up a piece of paper and he said, "I have in my hand a list of known communists working in the State Department." Now, the problem is that he didn't have any such list. There was no proof, there was no evidence that there were any communists or communist subversives working within the government. But this unleashes what could effectively be called a witch hunt. In fact, some of you have probably read Arthur Miller's play called The Crucible. And if you're familiar with this, it's the story of the Salem witchcraft trials in 1692. But even though the story is about witches, the context in which Arthur Miller is writing is he's talking about this communist witch hunt. And so McCarthyism sort of takes on a life of its own. I mean, people start to accuse their neighbors and their coworkers of having communist ties, partly to deflect attention away from themselves, but also because they saw it as a strategy for getting rid of annoying neighbors or terrible coworkers. But McCarthy is going to cross a line in 1954 when he accuses high-ranking Army officials of having communist ties and committing treason. And he insisted on having televised hearings in which he interrogated these Army officials. But once his game was out in the public, people realized that Joseph McCarthy was nothing but a bully with no evidence. And he was destroying people's lives and livelihoods. And so after 1954, Joseph McCarthy is going to fade from the spotlight because of this embarrassment. But unfortunately, the downfall of McCarthy doesn't end McCarthyism. In fact, it builds us into a sense of conformity. As I sort of hinted at a moment ago, communism becomes a useful charge to hurl against the opposition. You don't like your neighbor? I bet he's a communist. I think he's kind of a strange guy. Maybe he's a communist. Or you don't like civil rights activists. They're just a bunch of communists. Modern art. Who understands that anyway? Bunch of communists. So it's this mudslinging that really has a damaging effect. And what it does is it forces groups to police their own membership. I mean, labor unions now have questionnaires about your political affiliation. School teachers are being interrogated. College professors are being interrogated about their political affiliations and their own private actions. And so this sense of conformity is very apparent in the 1940s and 1950s, because the last thing you wanted to do is to be different. You didn't want to stand out. You didn't want to draw attention to yourself. So Americans are going to become very careful about what they say out loud. I mean, even in a private dinner party setting, you're concerned about what you might say, or that somebody might not get a joke that you're trying to tell. So coming back to the questions to think about, how did the Cold War bring about another Red Scare? Because of this confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, there is this tension. And when you add in the factor of a possible nuclear war, it contributes to the anxiety of the situation. How did the Red Scare contribute to a growing sense of conformity in the post-war years? Because of HUAC's investigations and because of McCarthyism, people didn't want to stand out. They didn't want to be different. And so if they just blended into the crowd, then they wouldn't be suspect. So stay tuned for part 3 of the origins of the Cold War.